All right. Well, welcome to another broadcast of the North Carolina Masonic Research Society. And tonight we have Robert Johnson joining us again for the second presentation in his quantum series on the Tetragrammaton, or the lost word. Just a little bit about Robert. I really don't think he needs an introduction. Everyone here knows him, but he's got his hands in just about everything. He's past master of Waukegan Lodge in Waukegan, Illinois. Now currently secretary of that lodge, member of the Scottish Rite, York Rite, creator of the Whence Came You podcast, co-host of the Masonic Roundtable, editor of the Midnight Freemason blog, and a bunch of other things that we would take about another 20 minutes to go through. But RJ, thank you again for being here. We are really excited to hear your presentation. So whenever you're ready, it's yours.
Yeah. Hey, thanks guys. Really appreciate it. As your descriptor said that I had done the first part of this in person down there, and we had a lot of fun. It was great to talk to a bunch of brothers who, it was Esoterics 101, but really didn't. It's more of an explanation on other orders. But it was great to talk to people who had an open mind, which is really what a lot of this is about. So let me share my screen. Let's see here. Let's do... let's see. Hold on one second. And we'll share my desktop so you guys can see how messy that is. And you all see a blank screen? Thumbs up. Cool. Okay. All right. So I was going to do this presentation for y'all, but that one probably ruffled some feathers. So instead, I want to start this presentation off. I hope the audio comes through. So if somebody is hearing it, give me a thumbs up. If not, I'll turn up my volume and see what happens. But this is a little from Think Big. So if you guys heard that, can you give me a thumbs up, somebody? All right, cool. So that's kind of what this presentation is about. But I want to stress the idea that it's going to bounce around a little bit. So as we get started, this presentation, again, is it's an adaptation of a paper that I wrote that was published way back in the original part of my Masonic career, quote unquote, as we say. It was published in Miscellanea back in 2014. It's like the last paper in there credited as Sir Knight Robert Johnson, and it's the word and a theory to back it up. So it started out as this 5-page piece that really has, if you read it now, you'll be like, there's a lot of maybe factual errors in there, and there's additions to this, but it's since evolved again into several more pages. This adapted presentation. So at points in this presentation, I'm going to talk about Freemasonry, science, physics, sound, even some anecdotal stories, as much as I hate to bring things with no, tangible proofs to the table here, and some factual stories though. So, but because of the amount of puzzle pieces and how big of an idea that I'm presenting here, it's kind of, it's necessary to clearly state the position of the presentation before I dive in. So here is my quote unquote abstract, right? So through this presentation, I hope to establish that sacred words that we use in Freemasonry as passwords and other uses are illusions and placeholders for other magical words. Establish that magical words are an evolution of the idea of the word or the tetragrammaton, but also that idea that perfected, platonic perfect form or whatever of the idea of a word. It's just one archetype of this idea, right? It's just one version, but we'll focus on it because it's it's a little Masonic, I suppose. And we'll establish that these words are the evolution is outlined in numerous religious texts. So these words that are outlined in all these texts were perhaps not maybe a word, but more broadly, a real noise or sound. That is, they tell an allegorical story, which is an abstract way of explaining some real science. And finally, that science might actually prove that creation is the result of sound. Perhaps a word, the legend of which has spanned, generations, countless iterations. Some have been lost to time, some we still use, but they're always connected to this kind of ancestral etymological roots of the first utterance. So that is this idea of metaphysical and as a religion and a philosophy are unknown sciences, or maybe just forgotten arts. So this is an adapted Egyptian relief that I've shown in some other presentations. This comes out of a book by Milton A. Pottinger, Symbolism on the Treatise of Soul of Things. I mention it all the time. It's one of my favorite books. It has no actual basis in reality. We've never found like a hieroglyphic symbol that represents this, but you do see it later on in Manly P. Hall's book, which was written 25 years later. I'm not saying that Manly P. Hall has plagiarized anything. I'm just saying it also appears there. Masonry teaches us that Hiram was raised by the word. Now, I'm going to say a lot of things, and you're going to go, oh my God, is he going to reveal something? No, I'm not going to reveal anything, so don't worry. I just get close. We'll get close to the edge of the cliff. He's raised by this idea of a word, but not just any word, the word of a master mason. So I'd like for you all to take a look back. In fact, for you master masons that are watching, I want you to think back to the moment that you were raised, the sublime degree of a master mason, and received the word. And if you remember when the master told you something specific about it, he said, you can't ever give this word out, just like any password, right? Unless you're in the proper position. And then you had to be real quiet about it. So many scholars, Masonic and alike, have dismissed this story of Hiram of Biff. And this is fine. Again, this is kind of an allegory. But before continuing, there is something that we can mention here which does relate to Hiram of Biff, to the end all be all dogma about Freemasonry and what it teaches, which is also echoed by many religions, if not all of them, at their foundational level. So Hiram of Biff, there's this set of books called the Secret Books. This is how they were described to me by a person who showed them to me at the House of the Temple in the library. If you ever go there, look up Larissa Watkins. She will help you with all manner of things. She's amazing. However, she pulls these books out, and I'm researching the word, and I get out there maybe every couple of years, and I can get to this library, and I talk to her about it, and she says, check this out. It's related to your work, but she said, don't tell Art. So, okay. So here she's handing me these really old books, and I'm starting to read, and what's interesting is that in this book, the legend, there's a legend that's spelled out much like our own ritual books, but Hiram is called something else. They call him Qumran. Some basic research shows that this is a Middle Eastern word, an ancient one that means a pure soul and represents endless happiness. It stems from Ra Kurum, whose Latin translation is Horus, the same Horus of Egypt. And in failed translations turns Horus into Hiram. Failed translations, right? Horus is the savior or the Messiah. So this comes out of that actually comes out of Couture Coronati, his work. But those secret books where that word is referenced in that manner is actually signed in the back, handwritten in pencil by Albert Pike, of all people. We know that masonry was an operative art, and that this, in a way, is memorialized today within the operatives, which contains no less than 7 degrees. So these guys operate pretty interestingly enough. I don't know what's up. Do you guys see this weird green line? That's bizarre. Anyway, these guys operate out in Virginia every year at Masonic Week, and they confer some of these degrees. It's pretty cool. However, at a point, if we take Masonry's kind of historical storytelling on how these kind of broke apart and what was original and what isn't, variations on these really occurred, and the degrees get split. And so let's go back here. One of the first books that I was reading regarding the Master's Word is this book right here. It's Inner Workings by C. Bruce Hunter. The Origin and Meaning of the Master's Word. So if you read this book, he asserts that the word has a legitimate meaning, a direct relation to the phrase marrow in the bone. He asserts that this is just a hint to the original word and is a version of what we work today within our craft, and further that this simple hint is really all we have left of an actual case where we really did lose the original word. Well, that's the premise of this whole book. So I just saved you about 5 hours of reading. But the book is also poorly bound. I digress. The original 3rd degree being lost to time had been seen maybe perhaps antiquated, and then dealing with the central character of Noah, right? It's just removed so that the legend of Hiram is then implemented, while the other 4 degrees were adapted into what we now have as the York Rite, or the Royal Arch. And this is where we receive, quote unquote, the true word, right? We're always in that ever-long search for the real word, the real secret, whatever that could be. So give me 1 second. I'm actually going to pause for just a moment. Sorry about that, guys. My computer was freaking out on me there. So let's see here. Let's go ahead and resume the share and play. Right, so we were talking about this idea of the Royal Arch. So if you want to dive in again to the Royal Arch, there's tons of information out there. I recommend the book, The Royal Arch of Enoch, which is weirdly out of print, quote unquote, if you search up the Kindle version. Really good stuff. Anyway, So back to this idea of the dismissal of Hiram, which I said we're really not worried about the idea of the dismissal of Hiram. This is, again, uh, doesn't really matter to the idea of the word itself. But I wanted to um, set the record straight on kind of the allegory and mythology and where we're standing. So in another reading that I had recently done, right, The Lost Word and Its Hidden Meaning, George Steinmetz and Joseph Krieger, it's a book that I first found while browsing the Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite building in St. Louis, and a book I reference a few times in this presentation. There's a brief account of the word and how it was lost. Quoting the Bible and some other traditions, they agree that the sins of the people of Israel and their priests and king were so continuous and trying of God's patience that the wrath of the Lord arose against his people till there was no remedy. Therefore he brought upon them the king of the Chaldees, who slew the young men with a sword in the house of the sanctuary. Among the slain was the high priest, and so fast was he killed that he was unable to pass the word on. So this is another idea of how it was lost. Another great paper by Bromley tends to make an argument that says the word is actually a phrase likely meaning something like he who creates the gods. And you can look that paper up under the American School of Oriental Research. Manly P. Hall, Secret Teachings of All Ages, mentions the idea that the Tetragrammaton spelled backwards is like an evil being. So within that, I think some additional context can be had when you actually read Secret Teachings, but it is interesting nonetheless. But looking back in our degrees, there's a point where we receive this password. This password alludes to a lost word, or even the Tetragrammaton. And so do you remember when you were told that this word that you received was not actually this true word, right? Thinking back to that idea of a royal arch, or maybe you receive it in some other degree. But it will be, however, used in place for all lodges until the true word be discovered by future generations. So for sake of time, let's move forward to some of these higher degrees of the York and Scottish Rite. These systems where you discover the true word, its meaning, and to whom it is attributed. Which brings us to the subject on hand. However, before proceeding, we should acknowledge that there are roughly 3 versions of this word. Now, there are, countless versions of this word, but in Freemasonry, the idea of a supreme word is used around 3 versions with some variations, right? But they are used by the York Rite College, some by York Rite chapters, which I've noticed differs from state to state. And also one that is used in some states is also the same one used in some Scottish Rite valleys that use some older degree work, but also in the newer Ancient Accepted Scottish Rite Southern Jurisdiction 15th degree, we see a more modern ritual and a different version. But we can be rest assured that all of these must have their place, perhaps an ancient place in relation to the Tetragrammaton. Short Talk Bulletin, Volume 6, Number 5, is all about the word and contains some nominal information, but a key is that it references a book by Frank Higgins, whose premise is that the true word is alluded to in the craft degrees by combining the first letters of some fellows who appear in our 3rd degree and has been hidden the whole time. Now, the Tetragrammaton is the unspeakable name of God according to most religions. Also, the foundation for the legend of the word, in the Jewish faith, is we have several versions of the name of God, which you can see here on this plate that I think comes from Secret Teachings, but it's the 72 names all the way around. However, one in particular is represented by the 4 characters, which have a certain sound when pronounced. So in English, those sounds are best represented by 4 letters, namely in the sequence YHWH. So you hear all the time people who might not know better, they say Yahweh or, however they want to see it, but it's Yud He Vav He. Many religions teach that God creates all things with the use of the word. This word over time becomes the Gospels just through like kind of a loss of a meaning, right? It's not the word is a word, or, then now it's the good news. This is in no small part due to the evangelizing of the Christian faith, which, to be sure, is just a slight departure from its kind of original contextual use. But through all time, society, secret and open, people study religions and theology and deism, esoteric mystery schools, I'll put in air quotes, right? Teachings that we have searched for. We've just been looking for this idea of the true name, an unpronounceable name of God, and how to pronounce it, as if, it could maybe do something for you. You could unlock some secret. What would you do with this secret if you had do you manifest something? Do you what is it? Well, here it was advertised on Pinterest. You can buy the key to the Tetragrammaton, the ultimate power spell, for $444.44. Accomplish anything you want. I don't know about you, but I don't know. At the time I found this, I think it only had one Google Plus. It's not even a thing. Funny nonetheless, right? So what would you do, somehow tame this thing for the mere men to use for earthly deeds? Let's talk about Egypt for just a minute. So there's this legend of this guy, Ra. It's an interesting story. Ra being the Egyptian creator of heaven and earth. So in this particular story that appears in a book by Wallace Budge, who some people think he's antiquated and not a great authority, but I still think that his book on Egyptian religion is pretty decent. But in it, he tells the story in plain English for us. And what he says is basically Ra is walking around on earth making his daily travels. Isis knows that he has this secret power by which all of his powers are manifested by this secret, quote unquote, word, which is through his name, but not the name Ra, his secret name. She devises this plan to extract the name by casting a clay snake. And then what she does is she follows him around one day and she like kind of scoops up some of his spit, because Ra is like an old man and drools or whatever. And she scoops up some of his saliva and she mixes it with the clay of this snake. And the snake, she places it in his walking path and it comes alive and it bites him. Well, because it's a magic snake, he's going to die, right? So in order to save him, she blackmails him, his life for his name. So at this point, he's freaking out and he calls all of his sons and daughters over and everything, and everybody comes over and nobody can help him out. And he says, you got to call Isis. You got to call Isis. So she comes. And he says, fix me, cure me or whatever. She says, no, not until you give me your name. He says, yeah, okay, no problem. I'm Ra. I'm the maker of heaven and earth. I'm the establisher of the mountains. I'm the creator of the waters. I am the maker of the secrets of two horizons. I'm the light and the darkness. I am the maker of hours, the creator of days. I am the opener of festivals. I am the maker of running streams. I am the creator of living flame. I am Khepera in the morning, Ra at noontide, and Atmu in the evening. She's like, nah, dude. She really just says, that's not what I'm going for here. I want your real name. She knows this isn't the name, or what we might call here in this story the word. She knew his true name was within his breast. Right? She tells him again, tell me your true name. And then he finally says, let Isis come with me. Now, Masons, check this out. Let Isis come with me and let my name pass from my breast to her breast. Pretty interesting, stark parallel. He gives her his name. No big secret today. We hear it all the time. Amun, right? The etymological basis for Amen. Amun Ra. You may recall reading a book in the Bible, Exodus, specifically 2019, that the people of Israel pleaded with Moses to talk to God by himself. because the sound of God's voice was too much for anyone to take. So kind of switching gears here. We've gone from a legend of the word to the power of the word. He said to Moses, speak to us yourself and we will listen, but do not have God to speak to us or we will die. How could that happen? Well, in Leviticus, it states, he who pronounces the name distinctly shall be put to death. Think about that for a second. Not who pronounces it, but who does it distinctly or correctly. So if I ask you now to jump forward to modern day, this is kind of where science meets faith, where exciting ideas become some proven facts, or at least mathematical probabilities, which can be reasonably tested with replicable results, right? We can do them and do them again and do them again, and they have the same result every time. Think of a modern day singer and his or her ability to shatter glass by using their voice. Let's see if this plays for you. I'm muting it because it will be very loud. But you can see they're playing a hertz through a glass with a piece of paper in it. And you can see the glass is vibrating. And at a certain pitch, right, what happens? It explodes. But now watch it in slow motion. Look what just sound waves are doing to the structure that makes up the glass. It's pretty violent. So now think about some stories that you may have heard about a genius named Nikola Tesla, his claims that he could split the earth in two pieces simply by matching Earth's frequency. I mean, we see it in a glass. Could you do this? Well, in his book, The Earthquake Machine, actually, I have another book on my shelf. It's The Amazing Inventions of Nikola Tesla by Nikola Tesla. And he has his patent in there for the earthquake machine. Now, granted, these things would need to be, massive, and you'd have to have one on the North and South Pole, but could you do it? I mean, the science is kind of, you could do it. But if that doesn't do it for you, what about the story of Jericho, right? It's another biblical story where we see an idea of sound marching around constantly, blowing these trumpet horns, and the destruction of a temple, or the wall specifically. So what about Isaac Newton? He says every action has an equal and opposite reaction. So if we now know the existence of black holes which suck things into them, crushing them and smearing them into a singularity, a point so small and so incomprehensibly dense, and yet we now know that there may be white holes. I guess that's kind of an interesting thing to say. We now know there are white holes, not there may be, right? And they're speculating that these things, they're spewing matter into the universe. So what does this have to do with the word? Well, simply put, can not a sound be used to create also? Could an entity of vast and pure knowledge, seemingly omnipotent, communicate in such a way, a word, its word, that brings about actual creation as we know it? Maybe even like a Big Bang. What's more strange is that science now more than ever might be actually to be able to support some of this idea. So we're going to talk about physics for just a moment. I don't want anybody to get weirded out or too scared, but I'm going to dive a little bit deep, but I'll try to keep it not too boring here. We know that everything in the universe is understood by using really two theories. We have the first, which is Einstein's general theory of relativity, which explains the ideas of the fundamental forces, right? The fundamental forces are gravitational interaction and some others strong interaction, electromagnetic interaction, and the weak interactions. The weak and strong are kind of bunched together. But really what we see mostly, we're talking about a lot of this, is electromagnetic and gravitational. Some new psychologists have started to think about the ideas of thought patterns in humans. And they say if you can measure a thought, then it must have mass in some respect, or you can measure it. So if that's true, then it must adhere to the idea of thermodynamics. And psychologists are the one who are answering this question, not physicists currently. And they say, well, yeah, actually, human thought pattern can be measured, and it does adhere to the second law of thermodynamics. Well, if it adheres to the second law, they also think that it adheres to the first and third. They just haven't figured it out yet. But the third law is right, this idea that nothing goes away. It just changes shape. So if we're thinking about that, it leads to this other question here. These four fundamental forces: gravitational, electromagnetic, strong and weak interaction, but also now maybe consciousness is a fundamental force. We'll see. Enough of that digression here. So of these, that's like the main one that we're looking at, but we're also looking, this one deals with the larger things, planets and suns. But what about smaller stuff? So the smaller stuff that we're using to figure out particle physics, and what we're using today for quantum theory, this deals with the smallest blocks of all things that exist. This tells us the following, so stay with me, right? So gravitational interaction, with the first fundamental force, is long-range attractive force that acts on all particles using particles called gravitons. Real creative name there. Weak interaction, which is responsible for some forms of short-range radiation, which can act on electrons. We have electromagnetic interaction, which is responsible for electricity-charged particles. It's also responsible for photons, so our sun. Strong interaction. This is responsible for holding quarks together, the little things that make up neutrons and protons, which then in combination form something called a nuclei. So I know that may be somewhat confusing. We went from a quark to a nuclei. This nuclei may at least sound somewhat familiar. This is just the plural form of nucleus, which we might remember from high school chemistry class, or if we attended school in any other country, grade school. Nuclei are what make up each cell of every bit of matter that exists. So if we work backwards, we've maybe found a clue to sound waves and a possible interaction on the smallest part of building materials and creation. So if we do just that, let's work backwards for a second. We have a cell, which then gives us a nucleus, and inside this, we have protons and electrons, and then we have quarks, which hold together those protons and electrons so the nucleus can stay together. Quarks are like the subatomic superglue. I really struggled with quarks. I really wanted to put an image of Quark from Star Trek Deep Space Nine in here, but I didn't know who would get it. Anyway, what are these quarks made of? Well, we're going to get there in just a second. Scientists for years, including Einstein in his last 30 years, struggled to figure out how to join these two theories together. These two theories being Einstein's general theory of relativity, the big stuff, and the theory that we use to figure out all the small stuff that we just explained in order to form what Michio Kaku is somewhat talking about, the unified theory. The problem with putting these things together was that when one tried to explain the other, everything breaks down. In basic terms, it wasn't jiving. And what I mean by that is we kept thinking like, hey, if we're applying these rules to these small things, the math is telling us that it's just not possible, right? And then what happens is they eventually test some of these things. And these tests are like the double slit experiment. Look that up on YouTube. It's a great teacher. And they'll show you why scientists couldn't believe what they were seeing. However, it validated the mathematics that they ran. So however weird, they were like, okay, well, I guess it's a real thing. And they're really still trying to figure out why these things work the way they do. However, so they're still in these things, they're still trying to dream of a singular equation, one simple formula to understand all things, still on the minds of everyone in the field. Finally, two guys worked out a theory that had been criticized in the past because of the anomalies, right? So we're talking about things on the big side, when applied to the small side, didn't make sense. But then when they tested it, they worked. Well, we find out that the things that we described as happening in the mathematics really did happen within the construct, I guess, of our own understanding. And the laws of nature in our physical universe, we still don't know why those things work that way. These discoveries were new. This new bonded theory they called string theory. And a precursor to this really is something from Werner Heisenberg, who was a theoretical physicist who won the Nobel Prize in, I think, 1932, maybe 1926. I can't remember which. But nonetheless, he really paves the way for a lot of this. But this theory that these guys proposed is exactly what they needed. It tells us that strings are what make up the quarks. So strings make up the superglue. If quarks are the superglue that hold the nucleus together, these strings must be the elements of the secret sauce which holds these quarks together. And these strings are described by physicists as like tiny little rubber bands that vibrate at frequencies and flip-flop around like writhing little snakes. Now, how big is a string? Well, if an atom were the size of an entire solar system, a string would be as big as a tree on Earth. Pretty small. This is the smallest form of anything that we know to exist today outside of the boson-Higgs, or the God particle. Is there something smaller than this? Well, science says no right now, because they are what they call fundamental. I described this term fundamental in a previous version of this paper as it is what it is. But that's not really what it is. Fundamental means a basic building block of. So just think about it that way. We just haven't found anything smaller yet, right? This is the ever receding pocket. So these vibrating strings that everything is made of can maybe be called the infinite orchestra of the universe. Let me ask you guys, what if the sound of the universe is simply an infinite echo of an uttering of a real word or a sound? So if we think about mythology and science and we kind of bounce back and forth, there's some unpredictable things that kind of pop into our head, and we're left, running circles in our mind trying to wrap our head around all of this information. As we know, there are no ways to prove some of these seemingly audacious speculations into the unknown. And yet there's a famous science fiction writer named Frank Herbert. He wrote a book called Dune. Some of you nerds out there might have read it. I read it. I made my wife watch the movie once. I got her to watch it once, just once. Frank Herbert says in a book, "The beginning of knowledge is the discovery of something we do not yet understand." So no presentations on these kinds of things would be complete or even appropriate without mentioning the late, great Stephen Hawking. In some of his writings, he's actually, he has exactly and perfectly asked questions that puzzle mankind. In fact, just one of the last things that he worked on was a new theory on time, describing it as both real but also unreal. We question the universe, and we want to know, and it's just really important to ask these questions and to speculate, because it's what leads us to the science. As humans, we tend to create new things, but this does not prove our understanding of the universe. Rather, the things that we invent help us to understand the things in our universe. Werner Heisenberg also said something along the lines of, we invent things to observe the natural universe. We don't actually witness the natural universe. We have to create ways of thinking about the things that we perceive to exist. So with that kind of circular logic, we talk about the dangers of that kind of logic. And it's always important to remember the people who do this kind of thinking all the time. The things in our universe that exist here in totality may not be normal for humans to comprehend. We're really small on the grand scale. Ludwig Boltzmann, February 20th, 1844. He died 1906. He died by hanging himself. Nobel Prize winner for physics, Percy Williams Bridgman. He died in 1961, killed himself. Andres Flohr, German, 1991, I think. He also committed suicide. James McCullough, another mathematician, 1847, he killed himself. George Robert Price, 1975. C.P. Ramanujan, 1974. Yutaka, famous physicist, mathematician in Tokyo, 1958. Alan Turing, 1954. All famous mathematicians who committed suicide after bouts of depression, arguably brought on by discoveries and ineffable puzzles in mathematics. What is it about these kind of things that brings these existentialism, this existential thought to man? It is important to recognize the contributions that those kind of people made to the scientific community, and to memorialize what they've done when we're talking about this kind of things. So I know that's kind of a bummer and a downer, but we needed to mention them. The mystery of sound. Let's talk about that a little bit. This is very incredible. Doctors, when posed the question, which would you rather lose, the ability to hear or the ability to see, have an interesting answer. But before we get to it, let's quote a national study which has shown that most people on a whim tend to answer hearing. Well, getting back to what doctors say, they say that you should actually choose to lose your sight because losing your hearing is more detrimental to survival. You need hearing more than you need sight. This is really interesting. Just a little piece of knowledge to say how important sound really is for at least human survival. The sounds are known through the ages as having mystical powers, magical properties, and even healing attributes. How deep does the mystery of sound go? So here's a few of those anecdotes I was talking about in the beginning. After World War II, the New York Philharmonic visited the American Museum of Natural History. During a rehearsal, an alligator, his name was Oscar, he began to bellow or kind of make this weird, low growl rumbling sound. And the Philharmonic became amused. The staff became curious. After several of the group played various instruments at different tones, it was discovered that the instrument didn't so much matter as the note did. What made him make a sound was a B flat. The experiment has since been tried numerous times, and many times with the same outcome, even when different alligators are subjected. This Indian temple is Padmanabhaswamy. It's a temple with several rooms that have all been sealed. All have been broken into, all containing riches totaling $22 billion as of right now. It's the richest religious site on the planet, privately owned, and this is just the top half. One door remains unopened, and they actually refuse to break in, as they did with the other rooms, because there is a quote-unquote curse. The only thing that can open it is a specific mantra. They call it the Garuda mantra, which no one knows, or perhaps no one knows how to do it correctly. References to the riches contained in this last vault are as old as 500 BCE. So what's the magic tone? Could something magically open it up? I don't know. There are some scholars who explore alternate histories. The Great Pyramids at Giza, they say, were actually sound chambers used to heal the sick in a time before recorded history, when the Nile Valley civilization was still what they would call a matriarchal society. There's a Scottish Rite pamphlet from the Valley of Jacksonville that states that the pyramids were representative of the name of God, each of the three sides representing a letter of the Aum, A-U-M, and they're also representative of the threefold knowledge of deity. The mystery continues with yet perhaps the most astounding of all. A B flat is also the sound projected from a black hole. In late 2003, almost 20 years ago now, scientists recorded an ambient sound wave emanating from the center of a supermassive black hole. Now, it's important to understand that when I say a sound wave, right, sound doesn't travel in space, but what they do is they take the radio waves and they transcribe it into a way where it becomes a sound. But this sound in question, this particular black hole, rather, is 250 million light years from Earth. So if we think about that marvel for a moment, this is 250 million light years away in a Perseus cluster of galaxies emanating a noise. It's an incredible distance. The speed of light is 186,282 miles per second. So if we think about that, if we traveled at 186,282 miles every second for a period of 250 million years, we'd be at the source of that sound. That sound that is emanating from a black hole is B flat. Obviously, this is not something we can physically hear. It's actually more than 50 octaves lower than middle C, which, doing some not easy math, is 1,000,000 billion times lower than the human ear can audibly hear. These apparent mysteries and discoveries have led to a newer field in sound research. The study of sound, sound vibration, and its effects on things are known to many as cymatics. Today, cymatics are somewhat of a wild science. The field is dominated by few people of any kind of accreditation, but it's admittedly a young field as far as modern academics are concerned. Cymatic experiments can prove to be entertaining, to say the least. I'm going to show you a quick video here of Colin's lab notes where he demonstrates some cymatic experiments. Now, you may have seen some things like this in Masonic lodges when they're talking about platonic solids and the sound waves like moving through speakers and making sand go into patterns. Well, let's see what it does to non-Newtonian fluids.
Cymatics is the study of visible sound and vibration. Let's say you play a sine wave through a speaker attached to a dish of water. Depending on what frequency you play, a pattern will be made in the dish of water.
So this is 125 hertz. Nothing too special.
Now, the effects on water are interesting on their own, but by mixing some of that water with about twice as much cornstarch, we get what's called a non-Newtonian fluid, a substance that flows like a liquid, but under stress stiffens into sort of solid. And this makes for some rather interesting results under strong vibration. Watch what happens as I turn up the amp using a 60 hertz wave.
So these cymatic experiments can prove to be entertaining, to say the least. Again, notice how something begins to happen to that liquid as the sound moved from the speaker through the liquid, and as the liquid seemed to almost come to life as it spires and reaches out of this containment dish into the air. The vibrations have created some kind of thing for our amusement. I created the same experiment at home with my son after we watched this, and we got the same results. So it's no tricks of cameras or anything. We broke 3 old speakers. It was pretty awesome. We made a huge mess. It's baking soda and water. You can try it at home. But it looked, right, like as if you were applying electricity going through, like a blob of, living biological tissue. Of course, we know what's happening, right, is these vibrations are moving through the fluid. The possibilities in cymatics, anyway, are as with any field in the sciences, they're really endless and really entertaining and fascinating. When we look at all of our rituals, the degrees we gather, again, we're going back to the idea of the password now and how that relates to sound. We gather a myriad of passes and words. Some are mere passwords alluding to some part of a degree. Others are sacred words, never to be spoken out loud. These words all have something in common: magic, or what seems to the untrained mind to be magic. The magic of words, from the rituals of our ancient brothers to a seemingly unrelated top hat magician at a child's birthday party, they exist and have a really deep history. Some interesting examples would include the ancient Sanskrit character, which represents a syllable or a sound, which, depending on your source material here, because there's a lot of westernized ideas that are told about these Eastern concepts. And so when I talk about these, I'll be using kind of a westernized understanding. This symbol in particular represents, in the Hindu language, it's the Om, the practice of the Hindu mystics. Even today, when we're doing certain, there's the Om chants or the Om meditations where we do Ah 7 times, Oh 7 times, 7 times, right? But this sound, it put at the beginning or the end of any prayer or mantra, they put it at the beginning of prayers and mantras because they believe it invites the deity to experience and listen, like a calling card maybe. In some Hindu customs, they believe that the divine and all-encompassing consciousness takes the form of this sound and through its vibration manifested all creation, and that the Om is the reflection of absolute reality, beginning and end. So Om is the vibration of the Supreme Being. The magic words have existed, like our fraternity, really since time immemorial, to coin a term, maybe not Freemasonry, but the ideas that we pull from. To pose the question, what makes, for instance, the word abracadabra magic? Well, upon the surface, we find its origin lies in this amulet, which is prescribed to be worn by sufferers of malaria in ancient Rome. This is similar to, you'll find articles on Abraxas, or this one says abracadabra. Well, abracadabra doesn't really come around until the 2nd century. But what's interesting is in this triangular pendant, they would wear abracadabra written across it over and over. With each succeeding line, you add a character or remove it until the end. And then you finally have abracadabra, right? So if one goes even deeper and searches for the meaning of that particular word, well, in Latin, it means to open the corpse. So that's interesting. Maybe it refers to letting life out or something along those lines, but pretty morbid nonetheless. Perhaps an allusion, again, to mortality. On the contrary, we find this all over the internet. They say that in Aramaic, abracadabra we find this impressive meaning, which is I create as I speak, but it's not exactly Aramaic. At best, it's a mixture of Aramaic and Hebrew. It probably means like I create like the word. So that's probably even more significant than I create as I speak. Could this be an ancient reference to the word? Could it be a reference to the power of will? Maybe. This is certainly why the phrase in pop culture magic, originally catches on and has been used, though the meaning has been lost unto all but the scholar, maybe. One would have to agree on this basis that there were even more and older sacred words which had quote-unquote magic powers unknown to mankind, much like the words that we use today in our rituals and rites. Maybe they don't do anything because, like the mighty Ephraimites of our Masonic mythos, they can't frame to pronounce it aright. Think about how I said earlier, I quoted that Bible quote that said, he who says it correctly or has a distinct pronunciation of the word will die. Well, studying the Tetragrammaton in its most common way today, if we listen to this part of the lecture here, the true secret, quote unquote, doctrine might be revealed unto you. The YHWH, Yod He Vav He, is of course a flip flop of the letters because Hebrew is written from right to left, and when we flip them around, we have this kind of Americanized version that we see on the front of a lot of texts from Scottish Rite and anywhere else because we anglicize everything. We hear and read in Masonic works, church, Bible studies, the word Jehovah, Yaldabaoth. The issue here is that without the vowels, the pronunciation is really only known to the ancients and was given to the worthy. Today, Hebrew scholars and the like, they will add clues to vowel sounds in the writing to, assist. But they didn't have that then. It was a secret to the power. So again, these Hebrew scholars added hints to these sounds of the missing vowels so the pronunciation would not be lost. But also, it's important, we're trying to pronounce a word by saying the names of the letters and matching them together. In a way, this is transliteration. So, for instance, my name is Robert, and the letter R makes the R sound. But when you say the letter R, it's the same as the word like A-R-E. The idea of pronouncing it is a mystery, right? So if we never, by that same logic, you would say my name is R-O-B-E-R-T, right? It's not Robert. So this is interesting because maybe it's not exactly what we should be doing with this word. Referencing the book again, The Lost Word and Its Hidden Meaning, it's said that within the Master Mason's degree, the true word is given, but we fail to realize the true impart of it. It is not the word, but rather the act of beginning anew, being now a spiritual man, quote unquote. Forgive my dog. The possession of an elevated mind with access to the cosmic consciousness. They say the word cosmic consciousness, the samadhi, the super consciousness, is in fact the possession of the Master's word. In a book called Emblematic Freemasonry, at page 282, quote, "The quest for mysticism is the work which man performs in his own heart and soul by the experiential science of love, raised to an ineffable degree and applied to divine nature for the attainment of the soul's destiny. And this is its end in God. The word is union." So again, maybe a clue. Another famous guy named A.H. Ward says in his work, Masonic Symbolism, that the word is love the divine self. Another clue. J.D. Buck, one of my favorites, esoteric authors, and by some weird happenstance was quoted in a Scottish Rite journal recently, maybe a year ago. I couldn't believe it. But J.D. Buck states in his work that the word is manifested in the jewel of he who is slain, and that it's about the balance or the equilibrium between spirit and material, certainly a concept that we're familiar with. The truth, we should all remember here to keep one foot on terra firma, earth. To realize that even to the ancients, the realization of the name itself was not the goal, but rather the importance was in knowing the essence of the name. 2 + 2 is 4, right? But the concept of 2 and 2 is amazing that we even get it. 1 and 2, the distance between is infinite, 1.111 on into infinitum, right? So 1 and 2, we just conceptualize. We can do this. It's really interesting stuff. The journey in understanding. Well, in conclusion, after taking you guys on a really wild and technical ride and just throwing all these parts up here and there, in the sense of hearing, the contemplation of the word, the science and mystery that permeates into all these aspects of life, sound and vibration, all their effects on all of what we perceive, I'd like to ask, or maybe propose, that creation itself may have sprang forth through an actual guttural, literal noise we refer to as the word, and is still causing creation through its infinite echo or vibration, perhaps in B flat or another infinite, incomprehensible key, in an octave so inaudible to us, by a higher, more intelligent, and seemingly omnipotent being we might call God. But also to remember that if those things are still happening and you are a person who lives in a biological meat suit, that really there's a lot of stuff that goes on outside of our bodies that we don't know what it is, right? We're just a thing and a thing. And this is a big meat filter. So think about everything that we're not seeing. And this is, of course, an image of perhaps what's really going on in the divine nature of the word itself. Maybe it isn't a real word. Maybe it's just a clue to using it to draw a person. The divine, referencing the divine self. To remember that the divine self might be some idea of a word. But that's really the end of this right now. I say right now because it's an ever-expanding, lecture that I add more to all the time. There's all these other places you can find me and my wild, crazy rants. Not totally crazy. Wrote a business book with my buddy John Ruark. He'll yell at me if I don't mention the book. Just kidding, he won't. And if you're interested, check out MasonicLegacySociety.com. It's another project we're working on. And if you want notes, and if I could send you a peer review on this presentation for you to rate everything I talked about and yell at me about things I may have overlooked, or if I was too tangential or whatever, I'll send that to you. If you send me an email later, that's all I got.
All right, RJ, that was a fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed that. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself. RJ, you got some time for a few questions?
Yeah, I'm up all night, and I'm in my shorts and a dress shirt, so I'm
Just
ready to
stand
go.
up, okay?
I already did.
May I make a comment?
Please.
I'm in my shorts also. In your comment about the difference, whether it's more important to have sight or hearing, when I was in college, my roommate, who was about 20 years older than me, he was back working on a master's, was born blind. And he told me the same thing, that he didn't feel that he was handicapped. He said, but he said, it's much more important to have your hearing than it is to have your sight. I just wanted to reiterate that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's good to hear a personal story to kind of validate. I've read the studies, and as I'm putting this thing together, uh, I would think all the time, like, what about seeing my wife? What about playing video games?
Yeah.
What about reading? But yeah, you're right.
Look,
We just
I
don't think
live
about
with
that.
I live with this guy. We roomed together 24 hours a day for like 2 years. It was fascinating. I was young in college. Uh, there used to be a thing in Reader's Digest that you could write about the most fascinating character I ever met. Well, I was young. I thought, well, he's interesting, but I'll meet more interesting people. No, I never have. Thank you for letting me comment. By the way, he was in charge of parking at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And I gave out parking permits, okay? I was very popular. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions for Brother Robert? RJ, I think it's fascinating when we talk about the lost word and the ineffable name of God, and there's a lot of theories there, and one thing that occurs to me is, why would God need a name? He created everything else, so who would have named him? Why would he have that name? If that makes sense. So I think when we refer to the name of God, and in this case the lost word, is speaking to something much deeper than an actual name the way we would define it.
That's right. And actually what's interesting is the whole idea of giving deity the name. For instance, I don't know if I'm just going to throw out the arbitrary, like 90% of America being some sort of a Christian faith. This is where we find some of the kind of, I don't want to say bad, right? It's not bad. It's just not known. The translation. So when we look at the idea in the Bible, right, when Moses comes to the burning bush and he says, "What's your name?" What's he say? What's it say that anybody can throw it out there? What does God say his name is?
I am.
Yeah. So actually, the Hebrew doesn't mean I am. It's much more elusive than that. So let me throw this at you. What it means is, I am that which I create. So, but the way it's being used is as a present tense verb in Hebrew grammar. So what that means is, God is not like saying, my name is I am. He's like describing himself as the current creative force that is acting now. Like he's not even saying it's a name. And that's what's lost in the translation. And it's fascinating. So we created the idea of a name. We have to call it something.
All right. Any other questions? I thought I saw someone with a question. Feel free to unmute yourself. All right. Well, RJ, I really do appreciate you joining us tonight.
I had a quick question.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just wondering, RJ alluded to another presentation that you didn't get because it was full computers, but it's really interesting. You know about listening to that?
Okay. Peter, you were breaking up really bad. I'm not sure that anyone, RJ, heard your question.
I'm sorry, you broke up for a bit there. What was that?
I couldn't hear your question. Can you ask it again?
Can you hear me right now?
Yeah, I got you now.
You mentioned that there was another presentation that you had wanted to give, but it might ruffle some feathers. Do you know where I might go about listening to that? It looked really interesting.
Oh yeah, so that's a piece I do on Charles Ledbetter. I've not. It's a presentation that I put together, and it's extensive, but nobody has asked for that yet, so it's not anywhere.
Well, here's one person asking for it.
All right, cool. Yeah, shoot me an email, man. We'll go nuts. Brother, I think I see Brother Patel in there. Are you there? Yeah, I see you. Hey, man, I just wanted to tell you while we were here, great job when you were on the panel discussion a week or two ago. Really appreciated that. Thank you.
Thanks, Brother Robert. Appreciate it.
Yes, sir.
Lots of interesting things, man. I'll probably be hitting you up later in the week with some ruminations of my own.
I would love it. I would love it.
So, Parth, I'm actually really glad you're on here because I'd like to get your thoughts, or maybe you can talk about it more from an Eastern philosophy as far as the Tetragrammaton, or, especially with the Hindu religion. How does that play into that? What are their beliefs, and how does that work?
So Brother Robert was actually very much onto something. When we examine the works of the Puranas, the Purans tell us that, pause, brief history lesson. There are sort of two major literary periods within sort of Hindu culture and mythology of sorts. There is the Vedic period, right? Which when Brother Robert was talking earlier, I pulled up my copy of the Vedas. This is in English. It's an excellent translation. I like this one. You also get things like the Upanishads, which I'm actually rereading right now. So those things come out of the Vedic period, which is akin to the classical period. And then you have the Puranic period, which is more akin to the medieval period. And within the Puranic system, there are sort of three major deities that are associated with the acts of creation, sustenance, and then dissolution. And in fact, all three of them are represented in that symbol, the Om. If you look closely, they all are there. And what I sort of find most interesting about this, and I kind of, one thing I was thinking about while they were talking about this was, Brother Robert spoke about the Nobel Peace Prize recipients who had passed or, committed suicide, or they were grappling with these real sort of things. And, I sort of said, okay, don't win a Nobel Peace Prize. Got it. And then I thought to myself, or do. And he said, I can't remember the exact wording he used, but he said that those who speak it in a forthright or outright manner shall die. And I guess based on my point of view, my question was, okay, go on, right? So it's more of a question of, is this a temporary death, or is this sort of more akin to what you would call a true death, right? Or what the Buddha calls nirvana, which is the escape from the cycle, or what I think the reference was made to samadhi earlier as well, which is sort of this state of just simply being. It's about as closest to that tetragrammaton as you can get. Or moksha is another sort of idea, which is this liberation idea. I can go on.
And Parth, somebody, Brother Ethan Smith just posted in the Facebook comments, he was wondering if there are any good books that you could recommend on the Vedas, and if there's anything you can think of, maybe if you post that in the
Yeah.
comments, and I'll be sure.
I will check the comments on Facebook later on, and I'll shoot them a link.
Yeah. All right. Does anyone else have any questions, comments, threats?
I would just add also, since we're talking a little bit about Hindu religion, one of the interesting translations, and again, it's an Americanized translation, so Brother Parth may be able to throw some light on this. But as I was looking through this, the idea of the divine nature of stuff, and looking at the word as the tetragrammaton is really an idealized form of divine self. Reading the Bhagavad Gita, right? Like there's a point within it where it feels like the war that Arjuna is about to witness is internal, right? It's right. So this is again this idea, right, that the absolute reality or whatever, the divinity has a real personal, part of the equation. So I don't know, I just wanted to make that comment.
Which part are you referencing, Brother Robert?
Just in whole, as I was, so in the beginning when it's talking about him and Krishna, well, at that point he's the charioteer, he hasn't revealed himself yet, and so he's taking Arjuna on chariot down the battle lines, kind of like everything's frozen, and he's like, "Look," and this
Okay,
is
yeah.
Arjuna's like seeing everybody on the other side. He's like, I don't want to kill my history teacher. I like this guy, whatever. And he's like, no. It doesn't matter if you choose to fight, not to fight. You're the only one who's going to live. That kind of thing.
Yeah, no. The best translation I've seen to that particular portion of it is called the dejection of Arjuna. But yeah, it happens right at the beginning, and it's absolutely, I mean, you kind of think about it, the war is fought before a shot is fired. The entire war is fought, and it's really kind of interesting because it harkens back to what we're talking about in physics, and it's a lot of what I do right now, which is trying to create this unified theory.
Yeah. And what I find fascinating about the reason why I reference Hindu religion, I put an emphasis on it actually, is it's really the oldest, I don't even know if you want to call it organized, but it's like the oldest recorded religions outside of animism. You know what I mean? Like it's the organized. And so it's the, even when we look at, you can go ancient aliens here if you want, right? But the idea that there is a really, really old civilization that has already been here before. Whether you want to take that mythologically or not. But even if you just take it philosophically, we're finding things that are mentioned in those texts, and then later in religions that are westernized later on, and we're starting to understand them and see this junction point between a philosophy and a science, which is just really fascinating. And how you were saying it's what you're working on even now.
I mean, yeah, it's probably the journey of several billion lifetimes.
All right. Well, does anyone else have anything to add to that? I thought that was fascinating.
Well, my issue is it was fascinating, and I don't have anything to add, but I have a question. Earlier in the presentation, you were referencing, you were talking about Ra and the search for his real name, and you were referencing a book, and I didn't get the title of the book.
Oh, so the book is called, one second here. Well, let me go ahead and grab this. All right, I'm back, and here you go. I did want to show you guys my awesome red nautical shorts. It's Egyptian Religions. Oh man, let me take this dust cover thing off. Oh, I can't. It's Egyptian Religions by Wallace Budge. So he was the keeper of the Egyptian and Assyrian antiquities at the British Museum for like ever. But let's see, can you guys see that? I picked this up at Half Price Books, so but it's a really good one. And he kind of anglicizes some things. And you know, I'll tell you that there has been corrections to this work, but the corrections are not like if you read this and spout off at this, nobody's going to go, "Oh, that's been destroyed." Everything in here is, I mean, it's pretty solid. There's some good. Where's the cool? There's some good plates in here too that show, like Isis feeding Horus and that kind of thing. Like after Set kills, and then whatever, like puts them back together and makes Horus. But lots of good stuff in here. A good cursory understanding, right? Because like the Egyptian religion is insanely complex. But yeah.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Okay.
I don't.
What was that, Brother Scott?
I don't appreciate it because I just had to pick up another book.
Well, so this, I mean, you get it for like, I don't know. I think I bought this for $12 at Half Price Books. University Books Incorporated, Syracuse, New York. I'm sure there's a good Kessinger reprint probably available on Amazon for $10 or so. Hopefully it won't set you back too much.
He's joking, of course, anyway, because there's no such thing as a limit on books, period.
Yeah, I know. Before I built this IKEA built-in, books were literally just stacked on my floor in here, and my wife was like, "You got to get these off the floor." Yeah. That's right. Just all everywhere. They're everywhere. Boxes and boxes of books.
Yeah.
And so RJ, Brother Michael Priestman has a question over here on Facebook. He says, where does intention come in with the word or sound?
Oh man, that's incredible. So let me share something with you. This becomes like kind of a weird thing in new age stuff, you know, as it comes out, right? Like later. I think it's on.
Yes.
So I have this here, right? It's the new age watchword. I embrace every opportunity to assert my dominion and prove the law. My mom's a new ager. This is like a tribute to my mom. But what it alludes to is the idea of asserting, the idea of even westernized, it's the law of attraction. It's the secret. The idea of the word itself, like if you really dig, then maybe there is no word, right? It's just this idea that it's you're the word. And so by actualizing things, even in the first 7 lessons of Builders of the Adytum, is 7 lessons in the practical occult. So that deals with that also, the idea of divine will, which might just be your will. That's probably all I can say about that. Not because I can't. I just don't want to go off into the deep end here.
Something occurs to me, RJ, and I might be just thinking out loud here, but when we look at a lot of the major religions, what they're saying is that we are essentially not only creations of God, we are more or less emanations of God. So therefore, we are a part of God or deity. So,
Yeah.
regardless of what religion you may subscribe to or deity you may believe in.
What does Parth have there?
Yeah,
He ran to get it. Yeah, the Upanishads. So
Yeah. So go check out the Mandukya Upanishad. Blow your mind, kids. If you want a really wild trip, go check out the Mandukya or the Katha Upanishad. Those are 2 that I find to be super inclined. If you're really kind of interested in the nature of self and interested in the nature of deity and sort of how those 2 things intertwine.
yeah, I also would add, you think about just the nature of the way things are written. God creates man in our image, right? So the age-old question, who's our? But then look at what we do today. We are creating AI in our image. Who is the creator now? Will man become the mythos creator, the mythic creator of the machines in the future? Will they, argue about these same things? Yeah, you can really dive deep on this stuff, Matt. I mean, but the Upanishads that Brother Parth was talking about, I've only been able to read, bits and pieces of those. And so I have to check those out too. But as some of the oldest religious literature on the planet, I don't know. Like, we always want to say the older it is, the more truth it must have because it's been less corrupted or something. I don't know.
So yeah, I think
Robert.
RJ,
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. This. Go ahead, Matt.
yeah, RJ, I was just thinking. We were talking about that, and you said that perfectly. That we are creators, or God, our deity, being the master creator, and we also are creators of our own. You talked about AI, and that's a little frightening. I guess resistance.
What you said though, you use this term. Did you say emanations, or am I saying that?
No, I actually did say emanations. Yes.
Okay, so think about, like, we just had did you guys already have Jamie Paul talk about Kabbalah?
Not yet. I'd love to have.
Okay, so Jamie Paul does a great presentation on Kabbalah, but like historically, that's 11th century. What comes before it? I'll make the case, and I'm not trying to upset anybody, but Neoplatonic thought, a guy, you'll see it sometimes as Jamblicus, but it's just because the J in German, but it's Iamblichus, and before him, maybe it's a little after, Philo Judaeus. I'm going to mix these guys up probably, but one of them basically says the key to union with God is an initiation, and the other one kind of takes Plato's perfect forms and turns them into emanations. And so this idea of emanations might be really Neoplatonic, coming from Platonism, which does later inform some Christian theology. And I think does inform also, later Kabbalah. And so what we love to study here in Freemasonry, even when we talk about Kabbalah in the Scottish Rite or even in Blue Lodge stuff, where it says, we should study the Kabbalah, really that's more of a, I don't know, maybe a Christianized type form in the way of its connection to Judaism back to Neoplatonic theology. And maybe the reason we don't touch that is because it's pagan. We've got, so we have a lot of things to think about, but the emanations, as you're talking about, is certainly there.
Hey, Robert. Hey, RJ. It's me, Renee, brother Renee from Facebook. I was gonna say was, yeah, to me, one of the similarities with the Vedas is the non-Harmony scriptures, which haven't been corrupted. And when I read that, I can see a lot of similarities, and you talked about Neoplatonic with Iamblichus and Philo of Judaeus, who lived at the time of Jesus. And, one of the great books to me, because I'm a big fan of Paul Case, is he uses a lot of Vedas, is Esoteric Keys and Alchemies. I don't know if you're familiar with that one. And he uses a lot of that with the Vedas, with the Gunas, et cetera, et cetera. And Budge, with that guy Budge, I know a lot of Egyptologists, they actually use his dictionary. And they use a lot of his dictionaries, Egyptologists, they use it. And the only guy I would say that uses a kind of some errors to his Egyptian stuff is Gerard Massey. There is some little errors to it, because Alvin Boy Kuhn, he kind of referenced him a lot. But yeah, William Budge, a lot of Egyptologists, they use him a lot. And they say that his is the more accurate from his dictionary.
Yeah, I usually will say people crap on Wallace Budge, on some newer guys, but I say that to cut them off at the pass, because
yeah,
I do love Budge quite a bit. I've got a few books of his. I've got the Leyden Papyrus by Budge, and his Book of the Dead, and some other things, and they're all fascinating reads. But I appreciate.
Same here. I'm a big fan. Yeah, I'm a big fan as well. I have most of his works.
Did you mention you were reading Paul Case?
I read that one years ago. I'm also a member too. I've been a member for 5-6 years now.
Yeah,
so
okay.
I'm
awesome.
So I'm a big fan of his. That book is a really great, really deep stuff.
Yeah, it's awesome.
It's really deep. But I was gonna say with the Vedas, if you read Plutarch and his Moralia, he actually says something very interesting in relation to Vishnu and Krishna, and most people miss it when they read it. He actually talks about Isis and Hippocrates, and Hippocrates floating in a lotus flower.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting,
Yeah.
But yeah.
That's awesome, man. Thank you, brother.
Oh, you're welcome.
Man. Those are really cool when you start connecting those dots. I remember I spent some time with Native Americans, and the Lakota have a traditional, like their traditional symbol for the earth is weeping white buffalo calf woman. And in the Vishnu Puran, when the earth is burdened by sin and Vishnu needs to take another avatar, the earth appears to Vishnu as a weeping white cow. It's nuts how all of these things that are seemingly disjoint, right? I mean, even if you look at sort of the mythology that's present within the Egyptian pantheon, you can and you connect that. There's also a white calf within the Egyptian pantheon, who represents very similar concepts.
Yeah, I agree with that.
If you guys, so I want to put myself out there. I do have an interest in some fringe stuff, right? One of the books I just finished was Graham Hancock's latest one, Earth Before or America Before.
America.
America.
Yeah, America Before. I have a.
Yeah. So the premise of the book is that some other civilization existed in the vast remote past, that traces of it are found in all of the other religions and philosophies. I don't know if I buy it, right? But it is interesting to think about it in that way. It certainly does solve that problem for us, you know. But it is a good read if you guys get a chance. It's a long read and it's technical, as is his style, but
Yeah.
it's
So,
fun.
yeah, I mean, so this is the book. Is that the one you're referring to, RJ?
Yes, it is. Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. How thick is it? Can you show me how thick that book is? Because I just did I did the audiobook, and it thing is like 30 hours or something.
That's a good 2.5 inches, probably.
Yeah.
But that's par for the course for one of Graham's books. But you know, that's the third in a series of books, starting with Fingerprints of the Gods, which came out in 1995. Then he followed that up in 2015, 14 or 15, with Fingerprints of the God. Oh, excuse me, Magicians of the Gods. And he really just laid on, you know, a lot of interesting parallels and facts that really made you think. And one thing I like about Graham's writing style is he never says, this is what it is, I'm right. He just says, here's the evidence, here's what I've observed, here's what is out there, and he allows the reader to make up their own mind.
Yeah, one thing that he did, if you guys ever get a chance, it's probably I'll just say it, it's the best book on the Ark of the Covenant, is Sign and Seal, that he did back in like the 80s or 90s. Here's the reason why. Every single book or every single TV, there it is. Yeah, every single TV series or anything that has to do with the Ark, you know, whether James Cameron is involved or Steven Spielberg, you know, presents, nothing touches what he did in that book, which was basically, hey, I'm going to take all my money, I'm going to use my connections to government, and I'm going to go there, and I'm going to see the damn Ark in Aksum. I'm going to do it. And he goes, and he spends every dollar, and he's bargaining with people and paying people off, and he's telling you every single little bit of the story as he goes. And nobody does that. And because he's considered fringe, nobody considers that book as like the legit best scenario of possibly what happened to the Ark. And man, that book is so good. It's really, really entertaining. And you know what I love about it is the end of that book. I think his book, like, rarely does a book get summed up beautifully. He paints a good picture and makes me feel all warm and fuzzy inside.
Yeah, I was gonna say that we were talking about like relation towards other religions and stuff. There's a story of the Ajwa, the Native Americans. There's a book that I have, and it has all the myths of their stories. And one interesting story is a little girl. She's walking, and a great spirit wind just goes with her, flies to her, and she goes to her grandmother, and she tells her grandmother, "Look, my stomach hurts." And the grandmother says, "Oh, my child, you are having a son who's going to be the son of the son named Jesus, but not with a J. Is Jeeisis." And I found that kind of pretty interesting. You know, I have not met any Andro Indians to have, you know, to see if that was correct or not, because I've been trying to contact some, but that was pretty interesting. Of a son of the son named Jesus, you know. So that's I know that Grant Hancock and his Fingerprints of the Gods, and I know he's a big component of Atlantis, et cetera, et cetera. But there's some say that with Plato and Solon, his ancestor Solon, when he goes to Egypt, some say that it's a possibility this can be the origin story of Solon or Solomon, you know, because he does see those big pillars, and he tells them inside you got two big pillars,
Man, I've
You know?
never actually thought about that at all.
Yeah, so you can see references there with the ancient writings on two big
So
pillars in Sais.
I'm gonna need your phone number so that my wife can text you later saying, "Ain't so hot."
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, and I'm gonna be diving into that. Yeah, I love that kind of stuff, man.
You're
Hey,
welcome.
RJ, are you at all familiar with the work of Michael Cremo?
No.
Cremo is a proponent of like not evolution in the traditional sense of the word evolution. Like that's Darwin. Darwin's got that figured out. Okay, but he talks about human devolution, sort of in this sense that as you go through time, you know, we naturally sort of devolve to more base layer. You know, we devolve in terms of our ethical and moral standard, more so than like on a physical or on a physiological or anatomical level.
Yeah, this sounds really Rex Mundi-ish.
Yeah.
So yeah, like as we sit here, right, and we get more comfortable with materialism, we tend to identify with or like become more basic. Is that kind of what it is, or
Um,
maybe not?
it is and it's not. It does. He harkens it back to sort of the Vedic system and sort of a lot of the mythology that surrounds it. In terms of, I think Matt have I can't remember where I showed you that breakdown of the time of time according to sort of the Indian way of breaking down time.
Yeah, I remember you showing that a graph to me on that.
Yeah, I can't remember where though. Shoot, I'd have to find it. But what they talk about is sort of that there are these four great epochs of man, and in the first one, man is sort of complete and will is sort of a perfected self. And then as you move through the various epochs, and that's sort of when the knowledge, like that foundation that we were talking earlier about with like America before and that type of thing, where that's where everything is sort of purveyed out. He's got some lectures on YouTube and stuff. You can go check him out. He's done a couple of things here and there on some other.
You said Mark?
Michael
Michael.
Cream. Yeah.
Okay.
I'll leave it in the comments.
Oh yeah, great. Thank you.
All right. Well, if there's no other,
Okay, I want to stir something up for a second. Now we were talking about Graham Hancock earlier, and also that the stuff that he wrote about, he experienced. They're not about research that he'd read and whatever, but the things he did, he experienced. And I know that previously you spoke about experiences with DMT and things like that, which Graham Hancock had also touched on. And I was wondering what you think that has to do with the opening of the third eye, the expansion of thought, and the things that may have been involved in previous rituals, which may have ultimately led to some of the questions that we were asking.
Yeah, that's a really awesome question. And I think I would preface that I just had a conversation with a friend of mine, Gerald Fortune. I was like, I got to have you on the show. And we started talking about this thing. And we started talking about the idea of the human meat suit, right? And like, you're limited to, we talk about in Freemasonry, 5 senses: hearing, seeing, feeling, tasting, touching, right? Scientifically, there's a bazillion more, right? But they all, like, if you throw them into, what's the term they use? Kant uses numinums, like buckets. If you toss these things into these buckets, these are the senses we have, and the human form isn't really designed to experience much more than what you experience. So, you grab something, you run your hands in the ground. One of the meditations I did with one of my old teachers was, he said, all right, now just like put your hands in the grass. And I'm like, Greg, this is not doing it for me, buddy. He's like, no, like it's the Christian idea, surrender, but a different like practice, right? Like feel it and like try to understand it and understand that it's like the singular thing, right? So there's this idea that the human form is in itself a biological filter. How do you change that filter? Like maybe the way to change the way that filter works is to like alter the CPU, right? Or the computer engine, the biological engine, the biological computer that manages the functions. So in this element, right, is this like the idea of psychedelics. I have never done any manufactured drug, lysergic acid or otherwise. I'll make that disclaimer. But it goes to say that maybe what some of these people did, whether it was simply to enhance the process or change the way we think. I remember reading an article years ago about Steve Jobs when he was battling pancreatic cancer. That guy did some sweet hallucinogenic drugs. He admitted to it, not during his process of healing or trying to survive this disease, but in his youth, trying to understand things differently. We look at psychology and we say, if I say red, you say, people are like apple. Well, when we do these kinds of drugs and they change the way your mind makes connections, it changes the status quo of like what you're going to be able to come up with as an answer, right? You're going to think truly outside of the box because you're messed up, well, quote unquote messed up. But the idea is that you're thinking differently. An article published just a few days ago, I think it was on Vice News, was this doctor who was talking about people should have the authority and ability to change the way their minds work, to remap their minds. So he's talking about the ability of veterans to use DMT or dimethyltryptamine or magic mushrooms, psilocybin to fix PTSD. You should have all these rights. But look at the rite of Eleusis, look at the rite of Dionysus, Zagreus, Bacchus, all of these things, they involved like a trip, like a real trip. You would drink, I think it's Kykeon. I can't remember how to properly pronounce it.
You mean ayahuasca?
Very similar.
Okay.
But Kykeon or Kykeon is a wine that they would lace with a poison that you would drink on the way to Eleusis, so that by the time you got there and you witnessed the play, which I'm probably mixing this, the rape of Persephone, you were so horrified, right? Your mind is in such a weird place that it's been changed. And then what happens is people like Alexander the Great later mention in their memoirs and in writings that nobody who's witnessed the mysteries is the same afterwards. They're different people. And I think when we look at all of that stuff, it really alludes to this idea of the destruction of the illusion of true death. Or maybe that, in terms of, modern day New Age theology, we look at things like apotheosis. We look at science's equivalent as a third law of thermodynamics. But when we're thinking about like those ideas, is like maybe those psychoactive substances change the way we filter, change the way we experience, and then change the way we perceive. And then when we come back, we're remembering right? So that nothing else, we see the world completely different. How many people do you know? We all know somebody, right, who's had like the near-death experience. I'm one if you don't know one. So like, I was going to die and I didn't. And so from that day forward, my wife has told me firsthand, I am completely different. I am completely different from the person I was before it happened. So whatever you think, maybe the drug is just the thing that like does that without an actual threat of dying. You just, going to have a, I don't know, like a threat, psychologically or something. And then you come out of it and you're okay.
You all right there, Matt?
Yeah, that's interesting. Circling back to Graham Hancock, RJ, have you read this book, Supernatural?
Excuse me. No, not read that one. I read all of the other ones, though. I haven't read that one, and he wrote an Atlantis one, I think, too. I haven't checked out.
He did, and I have not read that one, but it's sitting on my shelf. I have the complete Graham Hancock library here. But Supernatural, he does dive into the use of psychedelics, DMT, psilocybin, Anita muscaria, and even acacia melodica that was used in the Middle Eastern region, the burning bush, so to speak. And it's really fascinating. He makes the argument that it's not really a hallucination so much as it's fine-tuning
A revelation.
like a receptor, kind of like you're tuning in your radio dial.
Yeah, man. Like I'm laughing because I'm so into what you're saying. Like so the extreme example of this is people who say schizophrenics aren't nuts. They're seeing something. Right?
They're just operating on a different wavelength. Or RJ, I know you have children. I have a little boy. Yeah. Have your kids ever done that really freaky thing where they point right behind you or somewhere else in the room, and then they're like, "Hey, look."
Yeah. So I have 4 kids. Not only have they done that, they've also said things like, I don't know that I would ever wish this on my kids, but I always tried to be like the dad that was really open about everything, So one day my son says, "Dad, I feel like I'm not real." And of course, as an adult, I'm like, those damn video games. But then I was like, what do you mean? Tell me more. Well, I just feel like I'm stuck in a thing. And I'm like, yeah, I want you to hold on to that feeling because I don't know what that is either. But I get that too. Have a good sleep. But yeah, like the perception, right? I don't know how much, it's such a fascinating and amazing, and I'm going to use the word entertaining book. Is the book by Mr. Black, The Secret History of the World. One of the best audiobooks ever. It's a pretty thick paperback. Jonathan Black, it's a pseudonym. I can't remember his real name. We're Twitter buddies. Anyway, what an incredible history he gives. And what's fascinating is the idea of perception that he touches on. Yeah, I mean, I just plug his book. It's awesome. Jonathan Black, The Secret History of the World.
Well, that was awesome. So we totally went from the Tetragrammaton to Graham Hancock to P.D. Newman realm.
You gotta separate these 2 videos put the after conversation before the actual presentation. Nobody will listen to the garbage I was talking about. The conversation is is better.
It really is. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna wrap it up and end the live stream, but I'll be happy to leave the the Zoom call open. So if anybody wants to hang around and chat for a little bit, we can do that. But I really want to thank everyone for attending and listening to RJ's presentation. I thought it was absolutely fascinating. And I always have to go back and rewatch these presentations because there are always things I miss, and I'll pick up on the second or third watch. And I just think it's absolutely fascinating. So RJ, thank you again for taking time out to share that with us. And hopefully I'd love to have you back to do part 3 of your quantum series at some point.
Yeah, we'll talk a lot about in part 3 if we do that. That idea of the third law of thermodynamics, consciousness studies, and the idea of apotheosis, right? That man lives forever. Death is the illusion.
I want in. I so want in.
It is.
Let's do it.
We're in,
Yeah, we're in.
whether we want it or not.
So RJ, do you have any plugs for anyone like Mid-Atlantic Esotericon or anything you'd like to plug?
Yeah, so of course, Mid-Atlantic Esotericon is happening. They went digital, so the ticket price is reduced. It's going to be killer. I'll be doing a presentation on esoteric anatomy of man, which involves one of the images that I've been working on for, I don't know, like 9 years, too long, trying to discern that. If you can get up to Boston area for Ezekiel Bates, Masonicon was pushed back to the end of August. It's happening. Come out. My wife and I booked our tickets. My wife will be there. She's an awesome time, and she's more of a Mason than I am. And again, Masonicon Chicago is late September. I'll be having some communication regarding that coming out. Illinois is doing this 5-phase approach, phase 1 through 5. We're in phase 4 of reopening starting this Friday. I don't know if we're going to get to phase 5. And if we don't, we're going to have to make some interesting decisions. But nonetheless, as of right now, we are still on for an in-person event, and it's going to be a good time. So I would appreciate if you guys are interested to come to Chicago in September, mid to late September, and then come out and check that out. So that's it. And I really appreciate you guys all hanging out and doing all the cool stuff and putting these things on, and thanking the North Carolina Masonic Research Society for doing this, and Matt for being one of the busiest men in Freemasonry today, if not the most. Art de Hoyos told me he's done something like 28 Zoom calls since March. I think you got him beat.
Only 28?
Only 28.
Slacker.
That's right.
Really slacker.
Matt Parker. Only 28, Art? Matt Parker. That's the quote I'm going to send him.
I do 28 in a week. Come on.
Well, thank you, guys.
All right. Well, RJ, thank you again. That was absolutely fantastic. I'm going to stop the live stream. So everybody on Facebook, thank you for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed it. It will be up on Refracted Light a little bit later, probably in just a few minutes. So if you missed any part of the presentation, you can go back and watch it. But again, thank you for joining us, and we'll do it again next week.